Hello, I'm Ushma Neal with the Journal of Clinical Investigation series, Conversations with Giants in Medicine. Thank you for joining me today. I was pleased to get to meet Dr. Elias Zerhouni at the Lasker Award ceremony in 2023 and jumped at the opportunity to spend an hour with him today. Zerhouni, who is Professor Emeritus at Johns Hopkins University and Vice Chairman and President of OPKO Health, is a radiologist by training who focused much of his research on developing CT and MRI-based imaging methods to diagnose and treat cancer and cardiovascular diseases. He notably also served as Director of the National Institutes of Health from 2002 to 2008, and later as President of Global Research and Development at Sanofi. With roles in academia, industry, and government, no doubt we will hear some fantastic stories and insights. Thank you so much for joining me today, Dr. Zerhouni. Do you think you could start by telling me a little bit about your mother and father and what you were like as a child?
Yeah, I mean, as you know, I was born in Algeria, which is a country in North Africa. And my father was a teacher of mathematics and physics in middle school. And my mother was self-educated. She went to school for 3 years, and then she was thrown out of school by the French colonialists, but self-educated herself. And we grew up mostly for me, near the capital of Algiers, a few miles west of the capital, in a very beautiful small village on the beach. And so I would say my childhood was characterized by strong education. Parents wanted you to be educated, and the sea. While at the same time, I was growing up at a time of war, of liberation between Algeria and France. So I had a very checkered early education with a lot of interruptions because of the war. So I had to self-educate a lot. And my father really played a big role in that. But I was initially, I had 6 brothers, and my father wanted for all of us to become engineers or scientists, physicists, not doctors, not lawyers. He thought that doctors and lawyers were not the smartest people in the world. So that's how it started.
Excellent. I also read that you were a competitive swimmer.
I became a competitive swimmer because going to the sea every day, you become good at it. And eventually, when I went to high school, I went on the team, the sports team. That's where I met my wife, actually, and ended up in the national team for a short time. I couldn't keep up with the studying and the competition, so. Eventually, when I went to university, I gave up on swimming competitively, but I made the national team. I wanted to go to the Olympics, but didn't happen.
Wow. So tell me a little bit about what was your path towards medical school? It certainly sounds like you had some amount of familial influence there, but was it something you wanted to go after, or where did that interest come from?
All along, I thought I'd end up being a physicist or an engineer. And actually, all the way, after high school, I worked in a construction lab. I did some testing for concrete and steel, and that's where I thought I would end up, being a developer or building bridges and roads and things like that. However, during the university time, I went to the mathematics division, branch, and I didn't like it. I thought it was inhumane. It was like dry, and then I had an uncle who was a radiologist who said, well, you should really go into medicine, look at medicine, it's good. And then I had my brother who was doing that. And then I went to see the situation in the country, in the mountains, people were poor, tuberculosis was everywhere. And so all of a sudden I had to switch and say, well, I think I'll be more relevant treating people and helping people than building bridges. And that was a big problem for my father, who thought that doctors were stupid. They learned things by rote, and there was no science in it. And you just talk and prescribe some drugs. And he says, so you're going to kill your life, and it's going to be the most boring thing. That and lawyers. He hated lawyers as well. But my uncle, who's my mother's brother, just talked into him and said, no, look, there's a tremendous amount of science in medicine and so on. And at the time, it's true that that medicine was not seen as a leading edge intellectual activity, at least in my country. It was seen more as a business. You open an office and you saw a lot of people, you made some money, but that's what happened, and I switched at that time from mathematics to medicine at the University of Algiers.
So I read about how during medical school, you decided to opt into radiology partly because of this background in engineering. But how is it that you ended up on a path that brought you to Johns Hopkins for your radiology residency?
My uncle was a radiologist, showed me the first CT scan. It was the first image ever obtained by Sir Godfrey Hounsfield, who ended up getting a Nobel Prize for that. And as I saw the image, he explained it to me. He said, there's an X-ray tube, it turns around, there's a computational process, an algorithm that then takes the data, reconstructs the image, and you can see the brain, you can see the tumors, you can see the ventricles. And I fell in love with that idea because at that time I was getting bored with medicine. My father was right. There was a tremendous amount of rote learning. And you couldn't ask why this or why that. Every time you ask a question, they say, well, just learn what I'm telling you and go forward, right? So there was this sort of click of saying, yeah, well, maybe I can marry the two. And medicine on one end and physics and mathematics and computing on the other end. So I said, this is something I want to do. However, in that time, there was no computed CT scanner in Algeria. It was too poor. And so the recommendation was go to France, go to UK, go to Sweden, go to the US to get trained in that because it was an emerging thing at the time. And so that led me to take the exam that was the equivalency exam for the US. I could have gone to France, but my mother said, no, you don't go to France. And I said, why? I said, well, they abused us for 130 years. They'll abuse you another 20, so don't go. So that's why I ended up going into even though I didn't speak English at the time. And so I took the exam, and long story short, I passed the exam. My dean had trained at the NIH. I knew the dean at Hopkins and say, I have this student who believes radiology is the future. At the time, radiology was not a popular specialty. He really wants to marry physics and mathematics and computer imaging. And would you take him for a few months? He wants to come. And that was it. That's what started it. So it was basically connections and relationships. And at the beginning, it wasn't really to stay in the US. I was there for a few months, learn and go back because they wanted to build a hospital in Algeria, a university hospital. And so I thought that I would be there for a few months and I would come back. And I was already with my future wife at the time. So Algeria and the US were close at the time of the decision, but they evolved in different ways. So Algeria did not build the university hospital, became a military government that really became unstable and really no longer allowed the return of people like myself to go back. So it was in some ways, self-determined by the fact that the two trajectories diverged. One in the US, on the other hand, was actually the other way around. So I came for a few months, started working with, scientists and physicians at Johns Hopkins, and it clicked. I mean, they liked what I was doing. I liked what they were doing. And then there was a residency position that opened up, and they said, why don't you stay? And I said, yeah, makes sense. So I ended up staying and doing my full radiology training at Johns Hopkins, simply because of that bifurcation of history. I mean, if things had gone the right way, I may have gone back. If they had gone the wrong way at Hopkins, I would have gone back. But the opposite happened. It's just something I didn't plan.
Yeah, so from that point on, you kind of rose through the rank at Hopkins, eventually becoming executive vice dean. But what I'd love to talk to you about is the actual research and the science that you were able to do there, the tagging, the magnetic tagging for heart imaging, the calcium imaging to be able to do tumor diagnosis. So this sounds like it was both a boom time for the field of radiology, but also for you personally.
Yeah, it was perfect timing because at the time, radiology was not a forefront specialty. And it was the first one that truly brought in computerized imaging into medicine, right? So look at yourself. You're young, you have a background in physical sciences, mathematics, and then you like biology, and then you come to an institution like Hopkins, where the goal was really to better understand biology in a non-invasive way. So if you combine those three, you have a perfect situation at the time when the wave of computerized medicine was growing. And this is what I told a lot of my students. I said, what makes a great surfer? It's not so much the board they have or what they wear, it's the wave they pick. So in some ways, I was lucky because the wave of computerized medicine just happened at the time I joined Hopkins. And that's when I started to work on the issue of saying, what can you do to bring quantitation to biology? Because everything before that was analog, observational, empirical. It was not quantitative. And so extracting biological information with the techniques of the day, the technologies of the day, became my central research driver, if you will. And that's how I started. The first work was to differentiate benign tumors from malignant tumors in the lung, because we knew that calcium content was different between benign and malignant tumors. And that was my professor, Sten Siegelman, who launched this program and said, we should look for that. And I said, well, it's straightforward. We can look at CT numbers and we can recompute the quantity and the density. And so that was my first research project, really, to differentiate lung tumors, because at that time, many patients were operated for lung nodules, which in the majority were benign. So there was a lot of unnecessary surgery and complications thereof and so on. So the same thing happened in MRI. I mean, when people were looking at the heart beating and so on, they couldn't measure it. So I came up with a technique called tagging, where with radio frequency, you can actually impose a pattern on the heart that you can follow as the heart is contracting and measure.
You rose through the ranks, got to some of the highest echelons of leadership at Hopkins, and we're on this wonderful trajectory. So did the approach to you about becoming the NIH director surprise you? How did you decide to actually take that seriously and consider it?
This was a total surprise, to be honest with you. I had no inkling whatsoever, nor any ambition to become an NIH director. The thing is, one thing after another leads to an opportunity that gets created, again, because of the conjunction of events that occur at the same time. You get synergy of events for no planning whatsoever. So let me just tell you, in 1995, I became chairman of my department. And at that time, there was a crisis at Hopkins, and very quickly after that, I was asked to be the executive vice dean, because I was telling the dean and those who would listen that Hopkins was in trouble, that financially we were not doing well, that we had these siloed departments, there was no way of bringing the science together. Anyway, in a university, if you complain too much, you end up being asked to do the job, and so that's what happened. But then very quickly after that, Rick Klausner was the head of the National Cancer Institute, had his staff call me. He wanted to do a strategic planning for the National Cancer Institute, and he wanted a group to do the imaging forward strategic planning for cancer. And at that time, there was no imaging institute. It was all done by the National Cancer Institute. And I was so busy, with the executive vice dean job and starting to be a chair. I said, no, I don't want to do this. I know NIH. I was an NIH grantee by then, but I had always a little resentment against NIH. And I'll tell you why. Because when I started to do my research on computer tomography, and I applied for grants and I got turned down. And the reason I was turned down was not that what I was doing was not good, because it eventually proved itself, but it was before it didn't fit. It didn't apply to the disease process that the Institute was designed for. So if you wanted to do it as a platform, as a technology enabling platform, you had nowhere to go. So, and I heard that story over and over again. So computer tomography, magnetic resonance, it was developed by industry. It was never touched by NIH, you know. Even PET scanning was developed initially outside of NIH. So I had a little bit of a bad feeling about NIH being wide open to all areas of sciences. And then he called me back personally. He said, I don't know you, but nobody turns down the NCI director when asked to do a plan like this. And I was given your name, that you had some ideas and so on and blah, blah. And I said, look, I'm busy. I mean, it's really hard. But then the fact was that I was talking to him and he said, I'm really serious. I really want to do something because I know when I told him my problems with the National Cancer Institute, I said, you're so closed in that I don't know that I can make a difference. He said, trust me, I'm trying to make changes. So I told him, I said, listen, I'm willing to do this. One condition, don't do what NIH does all the time, which is say, maybe we will do it. I said, the only reason I'll do it is because if at the end, I want you to say either yes or no. But I've seen so many things killed in the drawers by people who say, maybe. I said, no, you have to tell me yes or no. And I want to be the one putting the group together. And he said, you have carte blanche, go ahead and do it. And so that was my first real high quality interaction with the NIH. Everything else was grantee, fighting for grants and arguing with program managers. And that turned out to be a turning point because Rick was extremely smart and really empowered people to do good science. And so we came up with a plan called Molecular and Cell Imaging is the future of cancer imaging, right? And it was $100 million a year and creating these centers for animal imaging at very high resolution, and pushing people to do what I would call target tagged imaging with molecules, like the GFP proteins or labeling different biological entities from molecule to man. And surprise, he did it. And then I got a call from 1999, I believe, from Harold Varmus, who was then not the NIH director. He had gone to the Memorial Sloan Kettering, and he was president. And he called. He said, "Well, your name was given to me because I understood you've done some work on imaging, future of imaging, and would you review my department?" And I said, I will do it, but same thing. I mean, if I do it and I give you recommendations, you can say yes, you can say no, but don't say maybe. And so I put together a very small group, and we did that. We evaluated the MSK program at the time he took over, and again, same ideas. Radiology is really a quantitative science that should be integrated in the process, not like a afterthought. And he liked that and implemented a lot of it today. A lot of their plan came from that period. As a consequence, he asked me to be on his advisory council. So now all of a sudden you find yourself, gee, I created a great interaction with NCI. Now I see exactly how the issues that a Memorial Sloan Kettering has, and then the advisory council of Harold was quite a council. I mean, you had Axel on it, who became a Nobel laureate, and a terrific group of people. So all of a sudden, you see my perspective change from a siloed disciplinary perspective to a much wider understanding of what was driving, at least my field of science. But then through that, I connected to the advisory council at NCI, so I started to know what the issues were. And then seeing another institution and knowing my institution, it became sort of, an experience that widened your horizon. But what happened is people just knock on your door. And in this time, what happened was Steve Cass, who was the director of an institute, called me to become the head of the Imaging Institute that had been created. because I had been lobbying with many radiologists to create, and biomedical engineers to create an institute for that. Because again, we were frustrated that every institute would say, oh, come back to me when your idea applies to my disease. And I thought it was harebrained to do that. But anyway, we created an institute, and they called me and said, we'd like you to be. And I said, absolutely not. I'm just too busy. And I've been very busy with my department and bringing what I thought was an era of change and the school. And I really wanted to step back and enjoy a little bit my position. And I said no. And so the next thing is, when you asked me, was I surprised? I was totally surprised when I got a call from the White House. And I thought they were calling me to sort of talk to me into getting the Imaging Institute, because I had lobbied for it. They say, well, you pushed for it, why don't you lead it? And no, it was a total difference. They said, no, we're calling you for the job of NIH director. So that's how it started. And it was a total surprise.
Now, in retrospect, are there particular things that you found more impactful, more important, things that you had to fight for that you're really, really so pleased continue to persist?
Yeah, so the fact is that when I was approached to become NIH director, I wondered, why would I do that, right? It's a high risk step, and I didn't have the pedigree to be an NIH director. I mean, I'm not a molecular biologist. I didn't have a Nobel Prize. I'm not even in in biological sciences. I'm in radiology, for God's sake, a biomedical engineer. But what was really interesting is the conversations with the folks who did the research process. Immediately would be Congress, the administration, scientists, to say NIH needs leadership because it's a confederacy. There's no real plan. There's no coordination. There's 27 institutes and centers, each doing their own thing. At the time, the administration had committed to double the budget. And not only the Clinton administration, but the Bush administration. And so they said, wait a minute, we're doubling the budget of this agency. We have no clue what needs to be done. And yet it's just basically doubling the money on the same programs. So there was this concern. And they were asking every candidate, they said, what would you do differently? And I told them, I said, I would do what I did at Hopkins, and that is break the barriers between the institutes and find ways of making the agency adapt to new trends. I mean, I said, I suffered from the fact that it was unable to adapt to the rise of computer sciences. There was no computational biology support at NIH at that time. And I said, all of the sciences are converging, and NIH is staying on the side saying, oh, I don't do biology and medicine, that's it. And I don't want anybody to touch my money for physical sciences. I mean, structural biology is not done with pipettes. I mean, it's done with microscope. And, I mean, essentially crystallography and all of the derived methods. I did the NIH Roadmap for Medical Research, which owed me a lot of criticism, but also praise, because people said, finally, somebody's trying to change it. But I didn't do it on my own. I brought in 300 people, 300 scientists to come and do it. And obviously, I played a big role in selecting the topics. The fact was that there were two things that prevented progress. One is the authorizations go directly to the institutes. They don't go through the director. The director had no means to affect things. Actually, historically, it was taken away from the director, from one of my previous directors, Bernadine Healy, because she entered into conflict with Congress. And Congress is a very easy way to control you, is to take away your money. So when I came at the NIH, the director of the NIH had only like $10 or $20 million discretionary fund for such an agency. And Harold, who I had consulted quite a bit before taking the job, said, one of the most frustrating things about the job of NIH directors, you have no resources of your own. And he said, I would much prefer be an institute director than be an NIH director. That really resonated with me. And when I saw what the situation was, I said, that needs to change. And that's how we came up with the idea of a roadmap for medical research, so that Congress would know where we're going, what, why. and a common fund for initiatives that really can only be done by NIH as a whole, but not by any one institute. The second I was really proud of is the Pioneer Awards and the New Innovator Awards. I was really concerned that peer review was becoming very conservative. I'm most proud of that program. And then I was followed by the New Innovator Awards that for younger investigators, because my third point, and I finish here, and is the question I always had was, what keeps you up at night as an NIH director? And I told them, I said, it's the fate of young investigators. And I testified to that. I said, look, take somebody like David Baltimore. I mean, he made his discovery at age 27. He had his Nobel Prize at age 35. And look how impactful it's been. In this day and age, he would get his Nobel Prize before he gets his first NIH grant. And so some people said, oh, really? And others say, well, that means the NIH grant is more valuable than a Nobel Prize, which was not the right conclusion. But at the end of the day, that was the third priority, was to create space for the next generation of scientists. Now, the negative things on you talking about conflict of interest. I tell you, conflict of interest could have destroyed the reputation of NIH. I mean, it's like I was really got surprised because, what really surprised me was the degree of criminality of some of the cases, and I had to protect the agency. And now, people were saying it's the destruction of the agency, you're going to be an exodus of people. And I assessed the situation. I said, nobody's going to leave this intramural program. It's one of the best jobs you could have in the world. If you have your job, you don't have to apply for grants, you can do the research in the long term. I said, who is going to quit that? And so I said, but we have to have transparency. And it has not prevented NIH from working. Look, I mean, Moderna and NIH did the NIH vaccine, and the COVID vaccine. So I think there's a lot of exaggeration and heat. Also, I was not a conventional candidate. I'm more of a outlier, an outsider. So I didn't have, these support networks of people, JCI and all the establishment. I was not an establishment candidate. So I did what I did, and I was proud of it.
So how did you know that it was time to leave? And how did you make the decision about what your next step was, which was to go to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation?
Well, 7 years is long enough in any one job, I would say. I think you overstay your welcome if you overstay your welcome if you do. And by then, I thought I had reached a cruising altitude, if you will. Things were going well. I think there was no longer the sense of NIH needs to be on the examination table by Congress. Once Congress reauthorizes you, they leave you alone for a good period of time. They were happy. They said, now we know what you're doing with the money. Now they actually maintain our budget and gave us $1 billion for the roadmap. And so there was a satisfaction, and there was a bipartisan support for NIH at the time. I was able, despite the stem cell controversy, to keep NIH above politics. People saw NIH as a heaven of bipartisanship. I was able to build that, to say, look, guys, you can fight on everything you want, but this is not subject for fighting. Disease knows no politics. And so I had reached that level, and essentially it became like boring in a way. When I was thinking, what else can you do? I realized that either I would have to stay because, there were lots of Democrats who knew that, if Barack Obama was elected, that we would insist, Ted Kennedy in particular, that you stay. Well, I said, oh my God, I don't want to stay another 8 years. I mean, this is enough. And so I decided to step down myself before the election of 2008, because I think that's the elegant way to do it. In federal agencies, you have two ways. One is you get fired or you leave on your own. I decided to leave on my own. And then immediately right after, when Obama was elected, they asked me to be his presidential envoy, which I did. I did along with the Gates Foundation job as well.
So then what convinced you to move into a role in industry and specifically the role that you
I
had at
didn't,
Sanofi?
right, I had no intention of doing that, none, zero. And when I left the NIH, I mean, I was asked to consider some presidencies or, executive deanships and different institutions. And I really didn't have it. I said, I've done that. I've been managing faculty for 6 years in a major institution. I had a department and I want something else. I mean, I'm driven by sort of challenges, not driven by plans. And at the time, I love the grand challenges in global health. I think we had created a program between NIH and the Gates Foundation, and I thought it was terrific. And they invited me to say, why don't you come and help us on our research program as a research fellow? And I said, yeah, I'll do that. And so I did this, and I was presidential envoy for President Obama for almost 18 months. Obviously, these jobs don't pay very well. And so I said, well, maybe I'll consult. And in the consultation process, a CEO of the French company, Sanofi, who knew me from his days on the board of Research America. Again, you see, there's always somebody's got to know you to approach you, right? And he said, look, I have a problem in my R&D. R&D is not productive, and could you help me? I said, listen, I know nothing about industry R&D. I'll be happy to consult with you about the science, but, he said, why don't you do that? And so over the year period, I really looked at it and I fell in love with it. These people were not arguing about let's see grants to write papers, but they were really facing the mysteries of biology. They couldn't replicate things that were published in papers, and when they did, they didn't understand the results, and the results were confounding. And then you had models that didn't predict what the disease would be, and then they had this high level of failure. And I said, how do you live in this system where you fail 90% of the time? And I thought it was a great challenge. So they said, could you come up with a strategy for us going forward? And I said, yeah, I think you need to go into biologics, you need to go into antibodies and so on. They were in small molecules. Anyway, at the end of the day, after a year of that, I designed a strategic plan for them. And the CEO of the board came to me and said, look, you're not the kind of person that would stay on the line just advising us. Why don't you take it over and make it happen? I said, well, guys, I've never developed a drug. I'm not the guy to do that. And they say, yeah, but your ideas are the only ones that we've heard that make some sense. And that's how I end up taking the job. Not that I wanted, for me, it was the dark side. Can you imagine? And then I realized, I said, it's all prejudice. These scientists are terrific in pharma. They're really good. And this prejudice, these doors are set up by essentially people who don't really see the big picture or have special interests of protecting their territory. So they don't want any competition from anybody who's not part of their tribe. So there's a lot of tribalism in biomedical research and research in general. So the tribalism is really what I'm against, whether it be industry or government or academia or departments or disciplines, or that has to go away. It's not the world of today.
If you could not be a physician or a scientist, what other career do you think would have captivated you for a life?
I'm happy with the career I've had and the life I've had. I'm very lucky. I really think the thing that breaks my heart is the inequality in the world. So something in global, affairs, trying to break economic inequalities, bringing development. That's why I did the global health agenda and research. I feel bad. I go back to my country. I've been lucky to come here when I was 24 years old. I didn't even speak English when I came here. Look where I am. But when I go back, I said, I left them. I betrayed them in some ways. I didn't really do what I could have done. And so you ask me, I said, maybe I could have done more and better in that field, of international equality, political and economic equality. Yeah.
Well, there is still time, but
Right.
we thank you for all of your efforts on the behalf of American science, and thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to get a chance to get to know you better.